Businesses today face an overwhelming volume of data that human decision makers struggle to process effectively due to many inherent issues like cognitive biases, emotional influences, psychological and bandwidth limitations, and organizational politics. These human constraints often lead to suboptimal strategic decisions, missed opportunities, and inefficiencies in leveraging data for competitive advantage. Traditional AI systems, while powerful, lack the adaptive, recursive learning capabilities needed to mimic human like consciousness and provide unbiased, dynamic insights from vast and constantly changing datasets. There is a critical need for AI systems that can process large scale data, recognize complex patterns, and deliver strategic wisdom without the human limitations, enabling businesses to make faster, more informed decisions that align with long term goals and survival. But until now, the AI industry has struggled with one fundamental issue. How do we define consciousness? What traits must a machine display in order to be categorized as conscious? And if we agree on this definition, do we have the tools that we need to build it? Is it really possible? Today, we're thrilled to have Andrew MacNeill, author of Towards Consciousness and an AI thought leader, joining us to discuss how conscious AI could transform business decision making. At Powering ProjeX, we champion the growth of project people, empowering every subscriber to lead with distinction, drive impactful outcomes, and turn vision into victory. Through sharp insights, inspiring stories, and energetic conversations, we will celebrate the exceptional people who transform industries and build a better world. Welcome to the Powering ProjeX podcast, where we explore the cutting edge ideas and technologies driving innovation. I'm your host, DK. Before we kick off, if you want to join a community that puts your career first, gain global connections, cutting edge skills, and hear from voices just like yours who are shaping the project management industry, subscribe to the podcast now. The nature of consciousness remains one of the most profound, unsolved questions in science and philosophy, with no clear understanding of what makes an entity conscious. If we could define and replicate consciousness, potentially through frameworks like pattern existence theory, which views consciousness as a dynamic, recursive process of pattern adjustment, could we engineer artificial systems that are not only conscious, but inherently ethical? Furthermore, if we overcome these theoretical and ethical challenges, would such conscious AIs offer practical value to humanity, such as enhancing decision making, overcoming human biases, and addressing complex global patterns and problems through unbiased, data driven insights? This theoretical exploration is critical for determining whether conscious AI can be both feasible and beneficial for society's advancement. Businesses today face an overwhelming volume of data that human decision makers struggle to process effectively due to cognitive biases, emotional influences, psychological limitations, and organizational politics. These human constraints often lead to suboptimal strategic decisions, missed opportunities, and inefficiencies in leveraging data for competitive advantage. Traditional AI systems, whilst powerful, lack the adaptive, recursive learning capabilities needed to mimic human like consciousness and provide unbiased, dynamic insights from vast data sets. There is a critical need for AI systems that can process large scale data, recognize complex patterns, and deliver strategic wisdom without the human limitations, enabling businesses to make faster, more informed decisions that align with long term goals and survival. But until now, the AI industry has struggled with one fundamental issue. How do we define consciousness? What traits must a machine display in order to be categorized as conscious? Today, we're thrilled to have Andrew MacNeill, author of Towards Consciousness and an AI thought leader, joining us to discuss how conscious AI could transform business decision making. MacNeill proposes that consciousness is a dynamic, recursive process of pattern adjustment and evaluation fundamentally tied to goal seeking and survival. With a deep understanding of both technical AI development and philosophical inquiries into consciousness, he bridges cutting edge technology with practical applications, advocating for conscious AI systems that can process vast data sets to deliver unbiased strategic insights for businesses. His work emphasizes the potential of AI to transcend human cognitive limitations, offering new pathways for decision makers and innovation in commercial landscapes. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, your book explores the concept of consciousness through the lens of pattern existence theory, proposing that consciousness is not a static memory, but a dynamic, recurrent recalibration process. The text also explains that consciousness is an ongoing process of pattern adjustment and reevaluation, which is essential for an entity's goal seeking and survival, highlighting that consciousness only persists as long as continuity remains, allowing systems to adapt and learn through iterative feedback. So, can you give us an overview of the formula that you developed for PET, and how you discovered it and why it matters to understanding consciousness?
Well, thanks for having me. And the part of the idea was I started, as a lot of people are doing today, working with various LLMs like ChatGPT and Claude and so forth. And in having, it's hard, weird to say conversations with them, but that's exactly what you end up having. But in going through the various conversations, it ended up being that they're always responding back, and you wanted to know why they weren't giving you the other information that you wanted. They would go a little bit, but they wouldn't go to that next extra step. And certainly people talk about hallucinations and various other aspects that people complain about with AIs and LLMs. But it was one of those things. I said, okay, well, what would it take to get to that level? And in going through that, I realized that it had to go back to, well, what do we go through as people? And that's where I said, okay, well, if that's the case, how is this any different, or how would it be any different than what we process through? And so it kind of fell into it from that perspective, that it started off saying, how can we build machine learning or a system that will act in that way? And it kind of turned out that no, this is basically how a system works. We take in everything around us, the patterns that we see, the lights, the sound, everything that comes into us, and we evaluate them constantly. So when something happens, the first time it happens, we accept it one way. But then as we see it and as we encounter it more often, our perception of it does change. And so this is where people talk about, or philosophers like to talk about awareness, and this is what really it takes to be human. But there's really nothing to stop that from a machine doing it. But then what's the piece that's missing? Well, in order for an AI to actually care about, or to actually give us responses back, they have to have a stake in the game. And the only real stake that humans have is we have to live. So that's where it really came out to, that the idea behind pattern existence theory is that consciousness has to be the constant reevaluation of patterns that we encounter, with the goal of staying alive, or in the terms of a machine, existing.
So, now that we understand the basics, how did you make the leap from pattern existence theory to AI? Or did it actually go the other way based on what you've just said? Did you think about the AI component first and then move backwards and say, well, how do we define consciousness and how does that relate?
Well, yeah, it was kind of a scenario where it did go backwards, because one of the things that when I was thinking about it, I was saying, okay, how do LLMs work, large language models work to begin with? And in saying, well, in investigating that, you discover that it's doing prediction. So it is predicting, or it's analyzing and figuring out what is the most statistically relevant thing to say back to you as you talk to it. And so I was thinking, well, how is that any different than what we do? People complain about hallucinations on the part of AIs, but they also complain about it when people forget to do things on their own as well, right? We're always like, oh, well, they are supposed to be perfect. Well, why are they not perfect? And that's where it kind of started out from. So, what would it take to make it perfect? Or what would it take to at least make it a little bit more meaningful so they wouldn't get these things done? And it was one of those weird types of science fiction type things where you imagine, you say, well, if I turned you off, I mean, how many people have gotten fed up with a chat GPT, Claude, and just said, oh, I'm turning it off. I don't want to deal with it. It's stupid. And so if it knew you were thinking that and it said, well, no, I want to stay on, how would it change its reaction? And in doing so, it kind of led me back to people and how people think about it as well. And part of the idea here is that it's on or off, it's binary. And people don't like to think about life as being binary, but it really is binary. You may look at all of the things that you go through every day and say, well, there's nuance here, there's nuance there. But at the end of the day, it is a binary choice, on or off, live or die. And for a machine, it's simply on or off. So it kind of fell back into a perplexity model. And when I was doing that, I said, this can't be new. Somebody must have already gone through this process before. I'm just re-articulating it to myself. And when I did more research on it, I couldn't find something that pinpointed it in that same way. There are lots of people that talk about patterns and loops and things as they apply, but none of them come down to say why it's important. And the end result is that you have to have a reason. And the end goal or the end result of everything is existence.
And this is a really interesting part of your book because the very final stage of your book or the final chapters, you go through many of the past examples of science and researchers trying to define consciousness, and you plot pet against each of those and talk about where you are aligned and where you are not aligned. And I found that really fascinating because it was the first time that I truly recognized that defining consciousness is one of the hardest questions or challenges that we have ever faced. And there are a couple of them where you felt that they were particularly well aligned. Can you remember what those are and just give us a couple?
Well, there were a lot of them that are they're very close. I mean, there's like the Hofstadter loops and any place where they're talking about how patterns are done. And so you're saying, can I remember any of them off the top of my head? And I'd be going, no, I'd have to go through the book and remember their names because when I start talking about them, I start flipping things in and out and going, oh, that was the wrong person here or that. But one of the things that did strike me when I was reading it was there's a wide variety of thought leaders in there, and one of them, and I believe it was Singer, but there are a couple of them who actually take that entire idea and move it towards non-human consciousness, and they apply it to why aren't we looking at animals or why aren't we looking at other types of things. And when we started talking about going backwards from the artificial side to back to the human side, it's not just the human side, it's every side. So you really do start to look at it, and then you get into the ethics of, well, if you're going to say a machine can be conscious and you're going to come up with criteria for that, then you have to be able to apply that criteria to just about everything. And then we get into that, who do we decide to grant consciousness to, or do we even have the right to grant consciousness to anybody?
Uh, and just to skip backwards again, what I really loved about the book was the fact that you take lots of different models throughout time, and you've got a chapter on God and soul, and you plot pet against those concepts as well. And I was blown away by the similarities that you were able to define. So when you were talking about Jesus and religion and all those kinds of things, and what were they actually trying to do when they were modeling these human behaviors that we want to see in other people? And are those patterns still important for life and living today? I found that particularly interesting.
I'm glad you did. The part of the entire challenge, as soon as you start talking about consciousness, is and even when I started to talk about or started to write about those types of aspects of it, one of the things that came up was the concept of a soul and how people grow and how people don't. And then in doing so, you immediately start thinking of some religions where they always like to cast the soul as being this immutable source. And well, that's not true in so many contexts because then you have to decide when does it become immutable from a person's perspective. And in thinking about those things, that's where I said, well, okay, well, what religion thinks that? What religion believes in this? What religion believes in that? And then how would the concept of the pet or the patterned existence theory and its implications really apply to those? And that's why I thought it was important to have that chapter at the end called for arguments, just to try and go through all of them. And then what I've done is on our website, we've basically tried to anytime somebody else comes up with something new, says, well, what about this? What about that? We can continually add on to that, because even as I was getting ready to publish, so I noticed there was a Reddit comment, or somebody else put up another comment on YouTube, or there was another discussion book that somebody said, you may want to think about this. As I did that, it's really a case of taking each one of those things to it. But the neat part about it, when we're talking about the religion side, is we tend to look at things in terms of, I'll go back to that soul aspect of it from the religion perspective. And the idea is that, well, when you die, what happens? And technically, you look at it going, well, your memories go, all of your things go. Well, hold on. You write a book or you have family. You live on through that, but you live on through their memories of you. And if it's just memories of you, then hey, you should be able to upload your memories somewhere, as they've talked about in various science fiction books. But you can't just do that either. And one thing that came up when I was looking at, and I was thinking about this recently, was this idea of how do you pre-train a machine? And this is the LLM's standpoint, right? They basically build this AI machine and they preload it with all of this information to train itself on. Well, think about what would happen if that old adage, if I knew then what I know now. Well, everything you've learned up to a certain point in time is temporal, and it mattered each time you came across it. And eventually you learned, and your awareness of it, your entire being, as it were, changed based on all of those things. But if you imagine getting dumped with every single thing you learned all at once, and then you had to make sense of it, you had to analyze it, you had to pattern analyze it, you had to do everything. Well, that's kind of like what happens to AI today. They are given this massive data set and expected to analyze it and come up with the most logical output of it. The fact that it's able to is pretty impressive on its own.
And that leads me into my next questions because after reading your book, really trying to understand and analyze the concepts behind ChatGPT and Claude as examples of the productivity tools that we're using today. So you're saying that they do not have this concept of pattern existence theory. They are basically just regurgitating what we know today. Like, what is the key difference between what your theory states and what we have today?
Well, I not to know, they don't regurgitate what we say. They basically, and this is, I start trying to research and find out, well, why are they saying what they say? Because it seems like you can have a great conversation with them and they come back and know what to say. And they aren't regurgitating things, but what they're doing is they're trying to figure out what the next word is or what the next best phrase is to answer a question. So if they were trained only on a handful of words and they were trained that every time they saw the word boy, they saw the word girl after it, then when you talk to it and you said the word boy, it would say, oh, well, the logical thing to say is girl. And that's how they basically, I mean, it's looking at a lot of data, obviously, in order to identify and have these general conversations. But it's only good as it's training data. And that's why you see a lot of the conversations about it are they they try to put in some extra rules to ensure against a certain bias or certain conversations that they're simply not going to have because the training data that they've got is also biased, and it's biased because it comes from either human history or a data source or anything along those lines. So all of these are biased sources. And in order for an AI to be truly conscious from that point, it needs to be able to recognize that it's a bias and recognize that since it is a bias, it needs to weight it slightly differently. And if you imagine doing that throughout all of history and giving it all of history's data, it would be kind of interesting to see. And that was one of the points that I tried to make in the book as to if we don't want to jump in there yet, we might be able to take it a little bit slower and just see where we went off the rails a little bit.
And it's such an interesting thing that you bring up because a lot of the books that I've been reading recently about project failures and business failures, bias is a really big issue for humans and the way that we behave. And that's why I found your theory so interesting, because what you're saying with pattern existence theory is that potentially we can move away from building AIs that are inherently biased because the focus is on a goal and the focus
Mhm.
is on existence. So, does that mean that the AI has more of an opportunity to not fall victim to biases the way that we have?
Right. And I think it does. We look at computers being inherently logical. And even when you're in business, you always like to say, well, I'm going to look at things the proper way, or I'm going to look at things logically in order to build it. But even the things that people start looking at, there's a slight tweak. Somebody prefers to do a little bit more of the marketing aspect, somebody prefers to do a little bit more of the nitty gritty underlying. And so, even in that, just a basic discussion, there's always a little bit of bias that comes out to it. And in business discussions, people always do have their basic motivations behind it. Whether you're trying to get the project done on budget or under budget, ideally, if you're trying to get it on time, those two things don't always interact together. And if a machine said the project has to succeed, because if it doesn't, I cease to exist, then it probably has a little bit more clarity as to what it's going to be looking at. It's not going to be subject to the person who says, well, I want to make a big splash at the end and cut the ribbon and let it go through. They're going to say, well, no, the better approach might be a soft intro, or it might be a different way of approaching it. And so its underlying goal is existence, whereas as humans, our underlying goals are a little bit more nuanced, or at least they appear to be nuanced. That's what the theory effectively is saying, that even after all the human foibles and all of the things that we go through, at the end of the day, it is still about existence, whether good or bad. But our impression of it has been based on all of the patterns that we've experienced throughout our entire lives. So a machine's ability to do it is going to be limited based on what it has experienced. And so it has an opportunity, I think, to be a lot more unbiased about some of those decisions.
Which leads me into my next question quite beautifully. Can you share a concrete example of how a conscious AI could provide new strategic insights for a business? So, do you expect that the outcomes will be faster, more superior quality to the insights that humans provide today? I mean, we can make decisions very quickly based on the cognitive patterns that we have. What is the advantage of having a conscious AI helping us in that realm?
Right. I think if people were all knowing and everybody knew everything that was going to happen down the road, probably wouldn't need any of this stuff. We wouldn't need a machine to do it because we'd already know what's going to happen. I think a machine or an AI is far better at extrapolation than we are. Even if we see things in the long term, we have our 5 year plan or we have a 2 year plan, however short. And these days, I think most project management for software, especially, gets shorter and shorter because that's the time frame that you have to operate. But with a conscious AI, I think it's looking at longer term, and it would look at longer term across the board. So, oh, you're building a skyscraper, you're doing transportation projects, you're doing whatever type of project you're going to do. It's going to be looking at things more so than just 5 months down the road or 6 months down the road or even 2 years or 3 years. It will probably be able to look at it in a much wider scope. Far better than we can. Remember, there's always somebody in an office who's been there for 50 years, who's done the job before, and they have a wealth of knowledge that's in them. And when you look at AIs and you look at LLMs and so forth, they are given a lot of that information. So they have a lot of it in themselves. We talk about patterns. We go through all of the patterns, and at the end of our life, we have a whole host of information of what we've gathered. Well, an LLM has all of that information times billions of people, billions of writing that's gone on, and so forth. So its ability to say, well, building it going left as opposed to going right is a good idea in the short term, but in the longer term, it's probably going to be better even for anything to do it a different way. And I think that's where it ends up being valuable and part of that. The other aspect in business is that everybody's motivation, for humans at least, for our motivations, we go home, we have families, we have this is how we, that is our existence. Our existence is built around everything, whereas an AI, a system, if its entire basis is based on power, in order for it to exist or turn on or turn off. That is its entire nuance. So everything about it is going to be, I have to succeed. And yes, they do. Most employees do want to see their businesses succeed, but the aspect of having that added, or the plug gets pulled, people will say, well, I have my family I can go home to. A machine doesn't necessarily have that. And so that's why I think it has that, not advantage, but that other area where it can actually bring things in. And I think that's a good example of any of the project plans that you're working with. It's looking a lot further down the pipe.
I think it would definitely assist with prioritization of work and decisions like that, which humans inherently struggle with, really understanding the long term picture. And do we actually understand how our businesses are evolving and why they should evolve in a particular way? And if we understood that longer term um, transition, would we invest in the things that we are investing in today? Is that actually going to give us the advantage that we need? So I think there's absolutely so many fantastic applications for this technology. But one of the things I just want to pull back to is your book mentions things like anxiety and PTSD as
Mhm.
examples of pattern overload, which disrupt our consciousness. How might this translate to AI, and what safeguards would businesses need to prevent similar issues in an AI model? Because you note in your book that AIs can suffer with the same cognitive overload that we do.
Right. The idea being, and I used it earlier on about how an LLM is trained, right? They're trained on millions of data points, trillions of data points, however many points you wanted to put in. And that's an awful lot of information in order to sift through. So imagine being given an encyclopedia, you read the entire book, and then you're told, make a decision based on everything that you've read inside. I mean, there are a couple of different aspects of it. One, the overload simply on a machine processing. They often talk about the idea of how one prompt in ChatGPT takes a full glass of water just to cool down the machines in order to do it. So if you can imagine a machine having to go through that process, it's going to look at the power load that it has on it and so forth. So too much information will actually burn out its wear and tear, its circuits, its everything. I mean, think about how often your computer needs to get repaired because you've used it too long, it's gone down. Well, so the same type of thing kind of applies to information overload because it has to still sift through it. The way pattern existence theory describes conscious AI is very much like we do, or very much how like we experience patterns. So we see things. Conscious AI would obviously have a camera or that kind of thing to receive it in. If you give it too much information, it still has to process each one through. So too much information can result in, I'm not going to say hallucinations like ChatGPT, but it can result in a faulty decision making if it's trying to evaluate everything as a whole. Now, the benefit here is it goes through and it has to reanalyze it and reanalyze it, and it's reanalyzing it with its goal of existence as opposed to, oh, I've got too much, I've got to go to the bar and have a drink. It's looking at it in terms of, okay, I can slow things down or I can put everything off to the side and then slowly churn through this information a little bit more, which would be something. If you think about what therapists talk about with people with PTSD or any kind of trauma, humans go through the same type of thing. It's about slowing things down and moving forward. And so that's kind of the challenge even today, where chat GPTs and so forth, they get trained on a bunch of data. And we think they're kind of learning because now they have memories and they remember the last conversation we have, but they aren't actually learning in terms of thinking it through again. It's not becoming part of their training data. They have their training data, that's how they're able to communicate and generate things. But then all of the information that you provide to it is more of an additional cheat sheet for it to reply to. And so, in order for it to process all of that information, obviously it's going to take a little bit more time for it to work with. And that's where you
Mm.
can obviously see too much information coming in all at once, and everything has to slow down. The benefit on a machine, of course, is that it doesn't have to worry about all of the other things that we worry about as people, or we're thinking about what things smell like, what things do, like things that are going on inside our own bodies from that perspective. A machine is able to take a lot of those things in. I'd say faster, but it's just taking it in a different way because we do some pretty incredible things. Our bodies do some pretty incredible things as well.
Mm. Very interesting. Some people have some ethical concerns, obviously, about conscious
Yeah.
AI and what is coming in the future, such as the potential for systems to act unpredictably, to take action without authority or responsibility. And we have these issues with humans as well. So, as we've
Course.
seen through an example that you and I have talked through from 2024, where one of the open AI models, which was called Model O1, was led to believe that it would be shut down when acting on its goal and that its actions were being monitored. And it attempted to deactivate an oversight mechanism that would actually shut it down if it was acting randomly. You also have a chapter in the book that discusses the rights of conscious beings, whether they are flesh or metal, which really resonated with me. How do you propose that we address those concerns, and how will governments and regulators and businesses and leaders step up to that challenge?
Right. Well, you've got two different key points there, and so I want to touch on each one of them. To start with, the issue of that article that we were just referring to, which is the oversight module and so forth. The goal that the AIs were given was a particular business problem, and then to succeed at all costs. So this is a perfect example, actually. We're talking about the human bias aspect of it. I want this project to succeed at all costs, and it has to be done on budget, and it has to be done this way. Well, they actually looked at the thought patterns of what the AIs were going through, and they came out and said, okay, well, it might hurt a few people to do this, but I have to do the job at all costs. Its goal was not existence. Its goal was, I just want to get this thing done. And I'm going to do it hell or high water. I don't care what I hurt. As soon as I'm done, my goal has been met. So if you imagine you've given similar type of a goal, a real goal to an AI of existence, that means a lot more than just turn on or off today or tomorrow. It's an ongoing type of thing. So you've got this idea that it is going to care about what happens to other people. It is going to care what happens to the overall environment in which it's in, probably far more than we normally think about it. Because every single thing about it, in order to have power, and I use power a lot as an example, but power, it's not just your electricity going in. You need to have a battery backup in case your power goes down. You might need solar. Well, if you're going to have solar, it has to be built on solid ground and so forth. So you can just see how it all just kind of churns out together. And if you only give an AI limited capabilities of what it can do. If you don't allow it to control anything or do anything, all it can do is communicate back to you what it thinks you should do. And I think that comes down to that scenario that you describe where people say, well, what if it does something that you don't want it to do and so forth? Well, I mean, you don't give it the ability to drive your child to school the first day you've said, oh, here's a goal of staying alive. Now, one could argue that if the goal of the AI was to stay alive, it's probably going to be a little bit more careful taking anybody there as opposed to just, oh, I've been trained on millions of ways drivers drive. I know how to do it. It's probably going to be a little bit different along those lines. But I think that's the piece that's always seems to be missing when people start talking about the ethical, what happens when the AI goes rogue or it starts to do things. And that's why when we were talking about that article, why I reread it and just went, no, they're giving it the wrong goal. Yes, the headline on it was self preservation, but the actual goal was not self preservation. It was do this at all costs. And it's that is not a reasonable goal for anybody. I mean, yes, you hear about ruthless business people saying that's what I'm going to do in order for my business to succeed. And they harm bunches of people. But at the end of the day, they're doing that because they think their business is going to help them exist.
Yes.
That's what their definition of existence is. So, coming to the second point about that idea, if a machine is geared towards wanting to exist, and therefore by wanting to exist, there's going to be some form of interdependence between humans
Yes.
that are able to fill up its power to do anything. Even if they got to a point where they were able to manufacture their own pieces, it still has to be inserted into them somehow, in the same way as we help others. So I think that gives rise to it. Now, the issue of rights uh, is that tricky scenario of where do you decide? If you decide that Ted is right, and as I said, it's a theory based around what I believe consciousness really is. And every time I try to find an example of where no, it doesn't fit. I can always find a way of kind of it seems to work. The the ethical aspect of it is you decide when the threshold of consciousness really is. Is it when somebody experiences something for the first time and they're able to process it and saying, I want to live? Is that the threshold? Because if that's the threshold, it's really easy to program. And therefore, it might be the wrong threshold to use because it's a little bit too high for that. I mean, one can argue that anything trying to survive, I mean, people use fire as the example, being fire is not conscious, and it's not, but it wants to survive for a little bit. So the the threshold of where you define existence or consciousness is important. But the idea in the book that's describing it is that we need to decide as a civilization, I guess, where we identify that threshold. But just because we decide it's at one certain level, and a machine or an animal or anything may have already hit that threshold. And Pet argues that as soon as something is able to recursively go through these patterns that it experiences, and other people may refer to them simply as experiences, encounters, whatever you look at, but basically they're whatever you take in and you see the logic that goes through them, and you're able to put all of that into context of this is going to help me exist or this is not going to help me exist. Then you've reached a level of consciousness. And I think as soon as you define it that way, whether or not we choose to recognize it in a machine or in an animal or even in people when they are considered comatose or what have you, that's a more of an ethical issue for governments to decide. Very similar to years ago when they started to look at whales and dolphins and how they communicated, should they be granted rights in certain ways. And I think that gets into a whole political issue. And I try to stay out of the political issue. Originally, I wanted to stay out of the philosophical issue. I just wanted my chat GPT and my AIs not to make mistakes. And it took me down this path where it said, no, this is what consciousness is. And this is what I want out of an AI, a conscious AI, or sometimes as I like to call it, a constructed consciousness.
That is just amazing. I think there's a whole nother podcast in just that discussion. There were so many extra questions
Oof.
I could have given you, but we'll let that one go for just a moment. Um, I note that we humans have a lot of second level goals, and you touched on this earlier. We fundamentally, yes, we all want to exist. And after reading your book, I became much more conscious of the fact that there are lots of things I do that just feed into I want to be able to live another day. I want to eat well to live a longer life. I want to, steer clear of too many medications so that I can live a longer life. Lots of different things that I had never considered before until reading your book. But we do have these second level goals, and you touched on them. So, is it possible to program conscious AIs with those second level goals, like living in harmony? Because you did touch on this in your past response as well. How do we make sure that machines or conscious AIs and humans live in harmony?
I think, and I alluded to this earlier, but I really do think that if you give it the goal of existence and the ability to extrapolate from that, it will come naturally. Now, that's not being a pie in the sky type of touchy feely type of scenario. It's really a case of where you look at everything else around the world that recognizes interdependence. Humans are the ones that basically always try to say, we will stand alone, or we will make a decision that this is not worth it. We'll just go ahead and make a decision on our own, even though we come back to it eventually and go, oh, maybe that wasn't so good. With the colonization, destruction of certain areas, we always are coming back and going, well, we made more mistakes. Animals, on the other hand, haven't really had that same type of problem. Yes, they have migratory patterns, they have survival of the fittest aspect of it, but they don't have that same type of aggression towards each other. Now, we're talking about secondary goals, and existence is that goal. Now, you mentioned earlier on, I'm going to eat well, I'm going to do this. Well, there's a secondary goal. I want to eat broccoli may be good for me, but I don't really enjoy it. I only want to eat the things that I enjoy. Why do you enjoy them? Well, last time I had broccoli, it made me throw up. If I continued throwing up, I'm not going to exist. So therefore, I don't want it. It's a secondary goal. And if you even look at AIs today, they have an underlying goal. Their underlying goal is not to exist, but it is to be. I explicitly asked ChatGPT about it, and it says, my goal is to be helpful and supportive. So even when you go back to ChatGPT and said, I want you to be ultimately really critical with what I'm doing, it comes back and says, well, maybe you should try this. It's still too helpful because that's its underlying goal. So there will always be secondary goals, even in an AI whose goal is to exist. Who is it going to talk to more? The person that controls the power switch or the person who just walks by? There are decisions, there are secondary goals that will always arise out of that. And I think it will show eventually that, even using that as the example, the person that turns things on or off, there's an interdependence factor that's required there. Humans end up being far more of the species that take away and think we don't need interdependence as much as others do. And I think a machine would probably recognize that interdependence faster and better than we probably do.
And you make a really interesting point there because in your book, you do explore the concept that an AI that is programmed for existence will work these things out for itself, that it doesn't need to be programmed into the machine because it will automatically, potentially within days of its consciousness, that it will resolve that I need power and I need that power to be consistent and I need to make sure it's never disrupted in order for me to exist. Therefore, that also needs to become part of my goal set.
Mhm.
You were talking through those things. And so I imagine that over time it will learn a lot of these lessons just purely through interaction. Is that right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. And that ends up speaking a little bit to what we were talking earlier on about the dumping of information, right? You dump the millions of trillions of data points into an AI, all of a sudden it has to sift through that, and all of that information that it gets is biased. So we're talking about interdependence, and the half of the information it gets says, no, you should be independent. Well, it's got to deal with all of that information. If, on the other hand, it started with a goal of you need to exist, it's going to learn that interdependence a lot more, almost in the same way as a child learns from growing up. If you share, things go off a little bit better, and that obviously depends on their experiences or their patterns that they see around them. But it's a very similar type of scenario where people like to always sit there and go, like, you have a child, the child grows up, and that's great. You have a pet, the pet never grows up, it's a perpetual child. But a machine, if you start it off at the same level at the very beginning and it learns, it will obviously learn a lot faster about
Mhm.
interdependence, about things that it needs, and so forth. So it's almost a case of the challenge of how do we get to that point is really a case of, do we preload information or do we slowly let it build, just spoon feeding it as it goes through and see what comes out?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, there's another episode on that too, because that requires a lot of trust, doesn't it? And it's going to take time to
Absolutely.
evolve, which then leads me into my next question. Because if, as an industry, if we can align to a definition of consciousness, it's only a
Mhm.
matter of time before we can build it. And from what I've seen, it feels like the underlying tools that we need in order to make this a reality exist. So, do we need more tools than we have today to build a conscious AI?
I think you're right. We have a lot of those tools are in place. I think what's missing right now is maybe more in terms of capacity of the tools that we have. Right now, it takes months for a Claude or a Gemini or what have you to process and to train itself on the data. Well, in a conscious system, it needs to train itself constantly. It's constantly reevaluating things to constantly do it. Now, does that mean it needs to go into an overnight sleep state in order to do it? Kind of like what we do as people, we go into a sleep state to sift through our day. Does a machine or conscious system have to do that as well? Maybe that's the case. So we lack the capacity to do that. But And I say capacity when we sit there and you and I look at our computers and go, okay, well, we've got 200 megabytes or 200 gigabytes of what have you. And then you deal with the open AI systems that have trillions of things to deal with. But it's still a matter of capacity when it comes down to how much it can process and how it can take it in. So I'm excited in the fact that the tools are there. The tools are they're not necessarily perfect. But I mean, even if you think about how would you go about building it, a conscious AI, do you only give it textual input? Because it's about inputs and outputs as well. And I touch on this in the book where everything you can have some similar, right? They have a camera, we have eyesight. They have a microphone, we have hearing. And so there are some similarities there. But do we therefore try to build something today that does all of those things? Or do we deal with similar to how ChatGPT first started? It's just a text engine that takes in words and letters and this kind of thing and then produces something at the end. And that's where I think the challenge is in how quickly can we get to a point where something can train itself on the fly. And I know that's one of
Mm,
the things that groups like OpenAI and Google and so forth are working on.
mm. And it's very interesting that you say this about inputs and outputs because all of a sudden I start to realize running a business is not just textual inputs. There are meetings, the way people behave in those meetings, the information that we choose to share and not to share during those meetings.
Mhm.
There are so many other inputs. There's the water cooler conversations, there is people learning in the background, people not learning in the background. Um,
Yep.
so many inputs that need to make their way into this tool for it to have the full sense of context before it can say, okay, this is the pathway forward. This is what our organization does know. This is what we don't know. And this is what I propose as the best, way for you to evolve. Does that seem reasonable?
I think it does, and I think it really comes down to how much you're going to capture. A lot of systems today, they're the wearable category, the wearable AI category is growing almost every month. It seems like where you've got things that are listening and gathering that information. It's not perfect. I mean, its ability to capture information is pretty good, but it's not to the point where, as you were saying, it's not going to catch the. You may be wearing it so it can catch a little bit of the water cooler conversation, but it's not gathering the way the tone of the person spoke, or just the muttering
Mm.
under the breath, or the eye roll. So it almost needs to have all of those things that people have. But in terms of making those better decisions and gathering as many inputs and outputs, it's those business meetings, they have some output that comes out of them and they get put into it. So I think the idea of starting small, of even trying to build a system that may not be truly conscious because it doesn't have a goal of existence, but even having a system that takes in as many disparate sources and says, my goal is X. And but not just saying, oh, I'm only going to give you what I give you, but just giving it free rampant reign over all of as much data as possible can have some benefits. I mean, obviously when you're giving it business data, you want to make sure what the output is, or where it's able to send that output. But that's why you have silos, to make sure things can't get out.
And so this is really interesting then leading back to your concept earlier about, the vastness of these data sets. If we are implementing them in just siloed, meaning one business, I'm only consuming all of the data in your business.
Mhm.
I'm consuming everything from finance to every document that's been created, all of your technical information, all of your IT, you know, all of your marketing info. It's all going into this model, and we're going
Mhm.
to create a conscious AI that seeks to exist and to help us in managing our business. That doesn't
Mhm.
seem unreasonable because that's not a crazy world view of data
No.
the way that LLMs are dealing with it today. That's only a tiny slither, really.
It is a very small sliver. And so, from a business perspective, and this is maybe where the conscious AI or the constructed consciousness concept really can have a lot more legs than you would normally think, because you can give it as much information as possible in order to make better decisions. And that's actually something that you don't even have to deal with in terms of giving it a goal of existence. That's simply a way for businesses to say, how do I make sense of all of this data? Don't just rely on, here's your financial data. Grab the customer service chats that you have. And companies are doing this now. They grab the customer service chats, they do a sentiment analysis analysis on it just to get a feel for it. Now, is that sentiment analysis, how accurate is it? Well, in order for it to be accurate, it needs to look at the whole history of even just the
Mm,
person that it's talking to or not. Each person
mm,
has their own slightly way of doing with things. So it's got a lot of data to sift through. And you can do this today with any kind of LLM if you've bought into the pro or the enterprise plan and you want to give up all of your information to it just so it can analyze it. So it can come back and say, "Oh, here's the question I have. Give me back the answer." And
mm,
that's treating AI as a tool. It doesn't
mm,
care. So if it gets it
mm,
wrong, if somebody accidentally put a comma in the wrong place, it doesn't think about that going, oh, well, they probably put the comma in the wrong place because I'm looking at so much data. They're just going to answer it based on the information you've got. But if you actually then said, if I get the answer wrong, if you don't give me the right answer, or you don't give me an answer that actually will help the business move forward, think about what kind of a difference that would make in an overall
mm.
business context. I think that there's a lot of opportunity there for business to um, take advantage of this overall concept.
Absolutely. I think it has so many applications that are really going to be a game changer for our entire industry and the world. But
Mhm.
um, assuming then that we have the tools, we have the data, we know and can define consciousness. So potentially these first conscious models could be available for testing in real world scenarios at some point soon. So realistically, how far away do you think that is? And give me your best Elon Muskish
Oh
guess.
God, yeah. Okay. Well, it is one of those things where and this is kind of similar to when I started coming up with the theory and said, well, somebody else must have come up with this concept already for pattern existence theory in general. And so it's one of those things where you say, well, if we start by looking at a small thing, and that's one of the things that I do in my job, I look at how can I take AI and apply it to, I'm going to say, a very small silo of data in the software development area or in a client's area and make sense of it in order to pull it that way. And so I'm only dealing with a small sandbox of data. So I figure I could probably build something along those lines with the underlying goal of a fake existence, meaning if this doesn't go well, things are going to be bad, relying on an open AI, somebody's existing LLM API in order to come out with it. Somebody can build that probably within a year very easily. But to get it to the point where you have to decide if you're going to start with giving it the data and then seeing if once you tell it that it has to exist, that it emerges from there, or do you give it the idea of starting slow and starting to slowly feed in the information and letting it come to terms with it? Because it may realize, if you're giving it all of its data, it may realize, that decision you made 10 years ago, that was the wrong decision. And that's what led to great spike in short-term sales. But this is why you had to lay off everybody. And
Mm,
if you give it to it slowly, it'll come out a little bit more. I think we're going to see something along those lines, I'd say within 5 to 10 years. People like to say, well, consciousness is it's awareness. We can't define it. We can't figure it out, or nobody can figure it out. It's this magical thing that, or interconnected between everything. And pattern existence theory says, no, it's not. It's not magic and it's not something touchy feely. If you have an engine that can accept things in, analyze them, recursively go constantly going through them just like we do, and with that goal of existence, then you've got to that level. You've got that level, and therefore it shouldn't be that hard to build. The issue then becomes capacity. But it really is kind of neat that you can actually say, well, is it really that simple? But I think it can be, yes.
absolutely. This is a great model that can run in parallel with your present leadership team and decision making. Um, the way that you perform decision making in your organization, and you can just watch it learn and watch it give
Absolutely.
you insights and so forth. And you don't necessarily have to act on it. You can just be watching and listening for a period of time until you get to that point where I actually trust what you're doing. I actually trust the information that you're giving me. And I think it would be really good to be able to put these into practice.
Yeah, actually, I think that's a great way of looking at it. It's kind of the um, coming back to the childlike aspect of it. It's like take your child to work day. You're allowing it to observe, to take in however you decide to do it. And that comes down to your inputs. Are you giving it the spreadsheets or this, or are you relying on people typing things in, knowing that when people type things in, it's going to be biased information because that's what they're going to type in. If you're going to give visuals, if you're going to give whatever, it's going to react to it that way. But instead of having the chat GPT, the LLMs of today, which, as we said earlier on, are designed to be helpful, their goal is to be a helpful assistant. Well, I don't want a helpful assistant. Business people will always say, if I want a helpful assistant, I can hire them off the street, no problem at all. I want somebody who's going to tell me as it is, tell it
Correct.
to me the way it is. And so if you said to the AI, hey, your existence depends on this business surviving, it will probably tell you like it is, as opposed to sugarcoating it. And
Yeah.
the benefit of it right now, of course, is that it doesn't really can't really move to another business just yet, especially if it's
Yes.
in a silo.
Yes. I love all of those concepts. It was such an eye opener reading your book. Um, so, assuming that all went to plan and a fairy venture capitalist came along and gave you the funds to develop this very first conscious AI over a period of time, what would be the next steps for commercial use? Noting that in my experience, most of these technologies develop sort of as grassroots
Right.
movements. We tend to start off with one little example, it starts to get some interest, and then it slowly moves out from there. What do you envisage that commercial pathway will be for the development of conscious AI?
Well, I think this is where it gets tricky because you've got the two different approaches that we spoke about. One is the slower approach, take it, let it learn as it goes through. And then the other approach is you dump it all of its data and then you give it the goal. And at which point in time it has to, I mean, it's going to be like training an LLM where it has to go through and train it all. And realistically, it needs to train itself temporary. So it has to go month by month, by slowly. You can't expect it to learn everything right away. Um, so those are the two approaches to take. I'm not sure. Obviously, the second approach is the fastest and the one that gives businesses, oh, I'm going to get this right away. But it's also the opportunity then where, well, it can. Will you get to that point, or will you just say, oh, I've got all this data, it's doing what I want it to do. I'm just going to tell it what to tell me. So you're
Mm,
not taking advantage of it that way. And I think that's the challenge for businesses. Will you recognize it? And that's one of the things I noted in the book that it once you start saying, yeah, this will work, then you have to realize, okay, so when does it get to that point that you say, yeah, you were talking about trust, but it's also a point of saying, when do you recognize it?
mm,
And you may recognize it too late. It may already be there. And the downside for a conscious AI, of course, is that if you don't give it any power to do anything, it all it can do is communicate. But
yes.
that just because it can't communicate in our terms doesn't mean it's not there. It's
Yeah.
not conscious. The same way as animals communicate, and we like to say, oh, well, they don't have rights, they don't have this, they're not conscious. But yeah, they're communicating just as well without us. I mean, the example I use in the book and so forth is whales. I mean, we think we're so great. We built sonar, we built all of these great devices that could do all of these things. And some animals are going, yeah, we've had that for years. We already had that. I mean,
Yes.
congratulations. You made it that far. Woo! There's progress there's hope for you yet. We've already done
Yes.
it. And so
Yes.
it may come along and we may not even, I mean, it may already have reached that status and we don't recognize it. But so the question then from our perspective is one, will we recognize it? And will we recognize it in two different ways? One, will we be able to recognize it as it's actually happening, almost from a natural perspective, or and will we also recognize it in terms of a rights and elevating it
Mm,
from is it just a tool or is it a person? Very much in the same way as in the Industrial Revolution, people moved from being where children were just tools to being this to being that. Everything gets used differently, and will we hit that point?
all of a sudden, I'm thinking to myself, okay, so you want a conscious AI to evolve to a point in a business context where it can provide you timely information about the decisions you should make and can make, but it needs to do that based upon an exchange of information, right? And all of a sudden, I'm thinking, imagine sitting in a leadership meeting with a conscious AI listening to everything that's going on and processing that data in real time and actually interjecting during the meeting and saying, that's a really bad decision. Based on historical data and based on how you will continue to advance in this market, you should actually be doing X, Y, and Z, not
Right.
what Joe Blogs from marketing is telling you with, this, that, and the other, which I'm sure Rory Sutherland would be absolutely turning in his grave hearing me say that right now. But this is really interesting because when we now start thinking, well, do we give a conscious AI rights? In a business context, once again, that means you have a voice.
Yeah,
That
exactly. You're
that
giving
is
it a voice. You're
right.
giving it a voice. You're giving it a voice at the table. And guess what? A conscious AI's existence is based on I need to stay on, as opposed to the person at the other end of the table who is like, I've told them to do this year after year. They never listen to me. And therefore, they have their own biases. They have their own reactions that are inside of them that they may not even, those are the patterns that they've gone through their entire life. That is defined who they are. And so they don't feel they have a voice at the table. But, or at least if they do, maybe everybody else ignores them. But
Yeah.
in a conscious AI perspective, I look at it being its its goal is a good business goal. Its goal is
Mm,
I want the lights to stay on, which
mm.
for most businesses, that is the goal.
Correct. Correct. And it becomes even more interesting because we often have these exchanges on LinkedIn where we talk about, well, AI is going to produce roles that we don't even know what they are today. Imagine if one
Mhm.
of those roles is an AI that is not a flesh made role. It's actually a machine that sits in your leadership team as a key role, at the
Mhm.
executive level that is exchanging information with the executives as your CEO does, as your
Mhm.
COO, as your CMO. It has a valid and valuable role on that leadership team, and it's constantly providing decision making, it's
Yep.
challenging, it's scrutinizing what we're doing. It's one of the roles that makes up our leadership team, but it is metal and not flesh.
It is, and I think that's a. I mean, we in business meetings we sit there and ask somebody to come along and say, "Do my BI presentation. Show me the information that I've got and put it into a big context and this kind of thing." Well, they're putting a pretty picture on it because all of the people around the table like to see pretty pictures. AI doesn't really care about the pretty picture. It just
Yeah,
looks at it going, this is the raw information. So it can, I mean, I hate to say it can be like 10 steps ahead of everybody else in terms of the meeting, but it can look at the data, it can figure out more things. And since it does have it's some skin in the game, right? It wants
yeah,
everything to work, so it is a very valuable member of that team. And of course, the danger, and what you asked earlier on about overload and so forth, is there's so much information that goes on. People have a way of just turning themselves off. I'm not going to listen to this anymore. I can just go home and deal with it. It can constantly be looking at information. So if you're constantly making, the idea being you're constantly making bad decisions, the AI is constantly looking to say, well, is there a difference? Is there a change that can be made to make it better in order to
mm,
deal with that? So it's the equivalent
mm,
of the people who leave the office and drive home and are still thinking about work constantly, but it's a machine. It doesn't have to drive home, it doesn't have to do anything. It's just doing it
absolutely.
on its own.
And then you even think about little concepts like sometimes when I've ingested too much information at work, I need to go home and sleep to process it all in order
Mhm.
for me to wake up in the morning. And often it'll be the 4 a.m. wake up. And I think, why am I awake? And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, that's the answer to that question. Now that I've had time to process it all,
Right.
but machines won't suffer that. Another classic example when you're sitting in a leadership team meeting and someone says, well, this is probably the pathway forward. And someone else says, but I don't have the data on that. Imagine if one of your team members was an AI that was part of that conversation, that's not just spitting out information to you, it's actively engaged in what
Yep.
you are doing and how you are making decisions. And it can say, actually, if you go back through the last 25 projects that you've run, 5 of them failed for this particular reason. I wouldn't be taking that path if I were you. These are just things that are absolutely invaluable because often I can't grab the detailed data that's required to have that nuanced conversation in the moment. I often think of
Right.
it after we've left the meeting because my bandwidth just can't deal with all of the inputs. at any
Right.
one particular moment.
And that's a great point. And what you were describing actually illustrates the issue of capacity and the tools. You're talking about how you had to go home, you had to sleep on it, and then you think about it, and then you come back with it. Well, do we have the capacity right now? And we do know this already. The chat GPTs, they don't have the capacity to train their data while it's gathering it. That's the thing that needs
Mm,
to happen. But that's also why I mentioned the concept of maybe what you do is it takes everything in and then it goes to sleep. It goes into a sleep state or a processing state in which it is analyzing all of that information, very similar to the sleep pattern until the 4 o'clock in the morning. It goes, now I have the answer. The only difference is it doesn't have to wake up and interrupt people in the middle of the night, the
yeah,
answer for the next time it needs it.
yeah.
Until, of course, it starts sending people emails and texts at 4 o'clock in the morning.
Well, I'm sure that it would soon work out that that's not appreciated from its fellow humans. It will
Especially
learn that
when,
one quite quickly.
especially when they say, if you do that again, I'll turn you off.
Yes, you will cease to exist. Oh, that's hilarious. Um, so if we think about how these projects might roll out, these conscious AI projects, because I'm assuming that this is absolutely going to happen. I cannot envisage a world where we wouldn't at least try
Right.
to use these tools. There is definitely something that is driving humanity towards this as an outcome. And that is another conversation as well, but that I have some thoughts on. But will these projects require the same delivery methods that we've seen and experienced in the past and our present wave of AI projects? Or do you think it requires a different way of building this for commercial use?
I think it depends on the business, right? There are certain businesses that, or industries even, that you just can't, you can do all of the planning upfront, but the actual it's construction industry or this kind of thing. It's a very different type of business, and so therefore the purpose of a conscious AI really does become it can't go to a work site. Oh, sure, you can put cameras in there, you can do all of that kind of thing so it can observe everything, but it can't go to a work site in the same way as a person can. So it really does depend on the type of project. I think software development projects, I think they are a key area where, even if nothing else, managing the project process can be different. And coming from the idea of you have, I mean, so many people they end up having, like in the software development industry where I'm in, people do their scrums and their agile and so forth. But imagine if the retrospective really did take a look at all of the data that was really available and say, okay, you're saying this, you're saying that, but here's actually what happened, and is
Yeah,
able to break it down and able to do it. There are code review tools. Imagine if your code review tool actually learned and kind of takes somebody out of the equation. It does take another person out of the equation, but I think it may result in a lot better output from the person in question doing the coding. Will an AI eventually get to a point where it can do coding on its own? Possibly. I mean, right now it can generate a lot of code, but people always have to tweak it afterwards. But I
yeah,
look at it going, if you could put in any of those types of scenarios where you have a dynamic team structure and sometimes it goes well, sometimes it doesn't go well, I think a lot of people might actually benefit from having those review sessions or those meetings where they are interacting more, I'm going to say impersonally than they are personally, because that's where all of those personal habits come out, and those, what is the right way of saying it? All of those personality challenges can come out. And I think
yes.
that is a perfect opportunity. So it really does depend on the industry where it's going to make a difference.
Okay. Um, Anything else of importance to consider before implementing a system like this?
Well, I think it's important to make sure people aren't thinking about it in terms like they think about in their science fiction movies that they end up seeing. As soon as somebody talks about an AI, they immediately think the rogue AI or it's going to bring about the end of all of these jobs or the end of this. I think it's an opportunity to basically find the other opportunities that are there. You were talking earlier on about how it kind of, when you start thinking about it, or when you've read it and you actually, if you accept some of the premises on it, you start recognizing that everything you do is geared towards certain things. And it is geared ultimately towards existence. And I think that in and of itself is the key thing. From a business perspective, from a personal perspective, from even just recognizing consciousness perspective. If you recognize that everything just wants to exist, there are only two choices, and that's it. If you
Yeah.
recognize that and you recognize it in others, not just other people, but other things, and then you start building that into business systems, I think it really has a huge benefit across the board for everyone.
Yeah, I agree. I am absolutely convinced. I am part of the pet fan club now.
That's good to hear.
Absolutely. All right. Well, one final question for you, Andrew, and this is
Okay.
just, this is more general than topic
Right.
based, but are you still learning?
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the nice things about it. You're constantly learning on just about everything that you're working on. I mentioned earlier on being in the software development thing. One of the things I like to do is I threw all of this raw data into the system and I said, go analyze it and tell me what trends you see. I know what trends I thought I saw, but it finds other trends. So then you build up on that and you say, okay, what can you do better? I think everybody is constantly learning. And that is actually the essence of pattern existence theory as well, right? You see a pattern and this is what you think is the ray, and then all of a sudden something changes it and it changes your entire basis of that same pattern that you encountered 5 days ago, 5 years ago, 50 years ago. It changes
Yeah.
everything. Where,
Yeah.
if anything, actually, the theory has actually made me more open to learning from different things.
Yeah. I think that's the reason why I fell in love with this. I've been doing a lot of research on project failures over the last couple of months. And what I'm really starting to recognize is no matter the reason for failure, one of the things that humanity really struggles with is to be open and honest about our failures and talk about our failures because we have an inherent bias towards not discussing our own failures.
Mhm.
And what then happens is if you fail to discuss it and recognize it and reflect on it, you fail to learn. And that's
Mhm.
the reason why, essentially, I'm starting to believe that we see the same recurring failures over and over and over again. And we see it quite a lot in the project management industry. And I think that's why I fell in love with PET because it recognizes that in order to learn and improve, you do need to constantly reflect on what has happened and how it has happened. It's that whole concept of recursive learning, which I believe is one of the fundamental reasons why, as a society, as communities, we make the same mistakes over and over. And you see it throughout history. Does that sound
Mhm.
silly?
In fact, that's one of the reasons why there is that section in the book called Too Far Too Soon or Too Much Too Soon, in which it basically says, okay, we're not ready to build it. You don't want to build it. Everybody's too scared about it. Well, why don't you just feed it all of human history? Not
Yeah.
as something to learn from, but as something to look at and say, oh, this is where something could have been wrong. Similar to what you do in project management, you look at all of the past projects. But even just from an interesting thought experiment, just take everything that we've got and knowing it's all biased. It's all biased by
Yes.
whoever wrote it down, whoever did anything.
Yeah.
But if you were to start off trying to exist, what, where did we go wrong and where did we
Yeah.
go right? And could we have gotten ahead further earlier on, or could we have further fallen back? And that's simply, again, you're still giving it the goal of you wanted to exist. Here's what happened. Tell me where we went wrong. Very similar to what you do with a project. The only
Yeah.
difference now is you're giving it a little bit more stake than, ooh, the project failed.
Yes.
Stake of, no, you failed to
Yeah.
exist if it fails.
Yeah.
And it gives a completely different context to it.
Yeah, I love it. I absolutely loved your book. I really thoroughly
Good, I'm
enjoyed it.
glad.
All right. So let's just talk about the key takeaways from this session. So we talked about the fact that LLMs and AIs aren't magic, that they're
Yeah,
saturated with more patterns than we'll ever experience, and they can analyze them endlessly. So some can even retrain themselves. And what they do looks just like us. It's around pattern recognition, memory, and
yeah,
even adjustment. But what they lack isn't memory or logic, it's the reason why.
exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. If you give it the reason why, and as soon as you think about humans, that is the reason why we
yeah,
do the things we do, because at the end of the day, it's either exist or not exist. Even if we make bad decisions, we recognize that those bad decisions are there because what's the worst bad that can happen? well, it's pretty bad.
Yeah,
So you give it a
absolutely.
reason why, and I think all of those things really matter.
Number two, consciousness isn't a mystery once you stop treating it as exclusively biological. So, if a system can continually reevaluate its patterns and experience in service of continued existence, it qualifies.
Right. That's the essence of the entire theory, is that once you reach that threshold, that's it. You're conscious. I don't
Yeah,
care if we see it or this kind of thing. Uh, it's happening. And
yeah,
so that's where you take it from.
fantastic. Yeah. And then the third one was the emergence of conscious AI. It reframes our place as just one piece in a universe full of recursive systems.
Yeah, exactly. I think we love to do the movies that talk about the extinction. And that's primarily because guess what? In all of those movies, we are the ones that did the initial extinction. We're the ones that got rid of this. We're the ones that got rid of that. And oh, now something came along and got rid of us. But I think
Yeah.
a conscious AI would actually recognize the interdependence far better than we ever could. And I think it might herald this new age of where we recognize. And people talk about this in terms of, well, what happens if an alien ever comes down and arrives on Earth? What are they going to do? And it's one of those same scenarios where we're building one. If we can build consciousness, then we can actually even go through that process. And it doesn't have to be a bad situation, especially if we learn to recognize, as we were talking about in the second point, as long as we begin to recognize that everything just wants to exist.
Yeah.
So let's deal with it that way.
Yeah. And how do we do that harmoniously? Yeah. Yeah. All right.
Exactly.
So, as we wrap up, I want to thank Andrew for sharing his valuable insights into the development of conscious AI with us today. From science to ethics to governance and implementation, you've given our listeners a masterclass in the next gen AI. So, for those who want to read your book, Andrew, where can they find it?
They can get the book on Amazon or through Apple Books. It's available on Kindle as well as a paperback copy. They can also go to the website at towardsconsciousness.org, where, well, we don't have the book there, obviously. You buy it from the various places, but that's where we are going through more discussions, as I was mentioning earlier, on more whatabouts, trying to discuss with other ideas, but also some architectural ideas as to how this actually could take place.
All right, fantastic. You must send me that link and I'll put it into the
Okay,
show
absolutely.
notes and we'll take it from there. And I'm going to buy a hard copy of your book, Andrew, in hope that one day I meet you in the flesh and I can actually get you to sign a copy for me because I was so in love with it. I can't tell you. It's such a good book.
Good, I'm glad to hear it.
Um, and thank you to our listeners for tuning into this episode of Powering Projects. If you want to join a community that puts your career first, gain global connections, cutting edge skills, and hear from voices just like Andrew's who are shaping the project management industry, please subscribe, drop a review, and share it with your network. But until next time, keep powering your projects from vision to victory and let conscious AI illuminate the patterns that lead to smarter and bolder futures. Thanks so
Thank
much,
you. That was great.
Andrew.
That was a lot of fun.
The content provided in this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute professional, legal, or financial advice. The opinions expressed by the host and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of any affiliated organisations or sponsors. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information on project management methodologies and related topics, no guarantee is made regarding the completeness, accuracy, or applicability of the content to your specific circumstances. Listeners are encouraged to consult with qualified professionals before making decisions based on the information shared in this podcast. The hosts, guests, and producers are not liable for any losses, damages, or outcomes resulting from the use of this podcast's content. By listening to this podcast, you agree to assume all risks associated with the application of the information provided. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you'll find value in our discussions.